So we're going to talk a little bit about compelling poetry and setting the standards for what we find compelling in a poem. We spoke a bit about what bad poetry is, what it means to write a poem that is not compelling, that does not move the audience, and we even found that those can be difficult to write. um, Trying to be as quote unquote bad as possible. I did mention that, you know, setting up this dichotomy, so between bad and good poetry, is a bit fake because it's not so clear cut. And of course, there are different standards depending on who is looking at the poem, who the audience is. There are different, all kinds of poetry out there that some people might find compelling, and others do not. And of course, even in academia, there are all kinds of debates around what makes a poem compelling, and whose poetry are we listening to, whose voices are speaking to us. But there are some, I think, basic tenets of what makes for compelling poetry, and you guys did a wonderful job coming up with definitions of what makes for bad poetry. So it's repetitive, cliche, boring, predictable, trying too hard to sound poetic, rushed and not showing any real thought. There are neat rhymes, meaning that it sort of sounds like a nursery rhyme. There's no use of figurative language, no attention to patterns or rhythms, saying things flat out without any mystery, no structure, or it deviates from the theme, or it doesn't even have a theme. So these are some of the things I just kind of summarized our conversations around what makes for bad poetry. So we can invert that and talk about what makes a poem compelling. My big, you know, motto, and the one I even have a t-shirt made of this, so if I were meeting you all in person, you would see this t-shirt, is surprising yet inevitable. Okay. So the all good writing, aside from just poetry, must at some level surprise us and yet also convince us, right? We must find it convincing as well as surprising. And it has to have both those ingredients, because if it's just surprising, well, then, we say, well, okay, that would never happen, so I don't believe it, right? If it's just convincing, then it is boring. But if it has both those elements, that's the magic key, okay, to all good writing. So move away from the predictable, using contrasts. That gives us some of the layering and the texture in a work. Select words that work on multiple levels. Okay, so it's not so each word carries baggage with it, carries associations with it, and so those each word can work on a multiple level. Consider the rhythm in poetry. Consider what rhythm you're using, and understand that rhyming is really complex and difficult to do well. So poems that rhyme often end up being pretty uninteresting because people are selecting words for their rhyme rather than for the meaning. So to make a rhyming poem, you have to be thinking about all those associations, all those meanings, all the reasons you would be selecting a word, and make it rhyme. That is a tall order. Theodor Roethke does it very well, and we're going to look a little more closely at that poem, which we've already been talking about, but not easy. And in fact, people often think, oh, rhyming, that's the easier way to go. That's poetry, but not so. I'm here to tell you that it is actually the most difficult way to go. Use concrete details rather than abstract words. And again, people think of poetry as being very abstract, when actually it's very concrete. It really deals with the senses. It draws on the five senses. Writing is a physical endeavor. It involves our entire bodies. In fact, when I write, luckily I'm alone, because you would see me moving around a lot, because I try to inhabit the words, trying to find the right words that fit the physical sensation. Create multiple layers by working towards nuance. And all of these things I just listed, that's what those do. They create multiple layers. They are working towards nuance. And that's what a poem does for us. That's why we don't just say it straight out what we mean, because every word, every line must hold multiple meanings at the same time. That's the magic of poetry. Otherwise, there'd be no reason to write poetry, right? We could just write a news article, say it straight out. But these are all those things, what we write about, that must live in that space of nuance. And that's why I think people get a little bit afraid to write or to read poetry, but actually we live in that space of nuance all the time. We're just not so capable of articulating it the way poets are. Okay, so My Papa's Waltz, and this is stanza number 1, and I've just broken down a few things I want to point out to you about this poem. So the whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. Okay, so that first line, we know from this, okay, when, the boy knows the drink, right? Knows it's whiskey. So this is probably a regular thing that this father's indulging in. Could make a small boy dizzy. That word dizzy indicates the boy's age, and it's not telling us his age, right? But just the word dizzy is a childish kind of word. And of course, paired with small boy, we get the sort of play involved in this poem. And yet the next line takes us to a very surprising, but I hung on like death. That does not sound like a fun thing. The simile, okay, the using like and as gives us that simile, makes this waltz much more frightening and gives it a bit of mystery. Such waltzing was not easy, and this now seems to be an understatement. Okay, it's hiding a lot of what's going on in this first stanza, and it's upping the tension of it. Okay, here's the rest. So we romped until the pan slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. Look at that word choice of romped. Romp, to play, to sort of, you think of children romping in a field, right? It has very kind of pleasant associations, playing around, roughhousing a bit, all right? And yet that works against that previous simile of I hung on like death. So there's both play and terror in this. And that's what I mean. We're getting contrasts. Roethke's using contrast to up the nuance in the poem. And we also get concrete details like pans slid from the kitchen shelf. These are things we can see. Note that, oftentimes when poets are just starting out, they try to use a lot of adjectives, and adjectives are actually much more difficult for us to see than verbs. Verbs and nouns are really the muscle of a poem. My mother's countenance, and that's her facial expression, her face even, could not unfrown itself. It seems like the mother is locked into one way of being or behaving or seeing the world, right? So she's not even going to be protective of this boy. We're even more scared for him. The hand that held my wrist, and here again, concrete detail, and holding a wrist, there's something that seems a bit engaging about that, right? When somebody holds your hand, that's one thing, that's sort of loving. Holding a wrist seems like you're not going to get away. Was battered on one knuckle. And again, we get a very concrete detail here, visual, but also tactile, right? We see that we can feel that being battered. And at every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. Again, tactile imagery, and it mirrors the rhythm of the poem. So there are these missteps, and if you read this poem, and we heard it read too, you hear the rhythm of each line feels like a waltz, feels a bit like a drunken waltz, actually. So that is mirroring the rhythm. And the rhyme is also giving us, the kind of young boy's nursery world that he lives in, and is also sort of pairing this moment with a dance, right? With something that's kind of neat and contained. And yet within that neatness and containment, there's this chaos. And again, contrasting traits, okay? Then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. And that word beat obviously has, it's a double entendre. It means it has two meanings to it, right? You beat time on my head, hitting my head, beating out time, but also beat to hit hard. So we're getting both those things there that relate back to that battered. And then with a palm caked hard by dirt, that caked really gives us both the tactile as well as gustatory. Gustatory means taste. So this imagery of both taste and touch in there. Even though, it's an adjective, caked hard by dirt, but it's really playing also on our other senses because of our associations with the word caked. Then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. And again, the speaker's desperation harkens back to that like death. Okay? So here is a poem that is really working on multiple levels, that there is no way to just take this and reduce it to a straight out informative sentence or two. It must, in order to contain all the movement and the emotion that it invokes in us, it has to be written as a poem. All right, so compelling poetry does the following. These are our takeaways. It relies on concrete detail rather than abstractions. So that's the showing versus telling that you probably heard before if you have studied any kind of writing. You want to show rather than tell. Of course, there are places where you are going to be telling as well, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about prose. But you're really working towards showing us, towards involving us, and that means getting our senses in there, getting us in there physically into the world of the poem. And that's what poets are doing. They're showing us rather than telling. Poems offer a new contradictory way of seeing a situation, person, or object, and that is that surprising yet convincing, surprising yet inevitable, right? Where it is both going to surprise us. Oh, really? Wow, yeah. Does it? And then you ask yourself, and then you answer yes. If you can answer yes, that makes sense. Then it is both surprising yet convincing, and that's the magic formula. It uses rhythm and rhyme for a purpose, not simply because poetry should rhyme. And in fact, as stated before, rhyming is the more difficult way to go. So, if a poet chooses to rhyme, there is a reason for making that choice. There's a reason for making that choice. And that's something to think about. If you're writing about a poem, think about why would this poem rhyme? Okay, it's not just random. There's a reason it fits, and we talked a little bit about that with My Papa's Waltz. And that is the end of this PowerPoint on poetry and poems, and so happy reading and happy writing.